This is Manlihood, the podcast for men who want to rise up and live with purpose. With your host, Josh Hatcher, this show is here to help you level up as a husband, father, leader, and man, with real conversations and strategies to help you in every area of your life.
Welcome to Manlihood. This is your host, Josh Hatcher, and I'm telling you guys, we're living in an age when celebrity pastors are falling left and right, and it's not a pretty sight. And honestly, it's one of those things where some of us see it happen and we're like, ha ha, told you so. That's what you get for being famous and saying you love Jesus, but then you're really just like the rest of us. And some people are just brokenhearted because they built this, crazy idol up. And some people are just like, whatever. But I'm going to tell you something. Today's guest, Tullian Tchividjian, is a phenomenal guy who lived this life where his whole life got built up really big, really fast. He's the grandson of Billy Graham, who was one of the biggest celebrity pastors of all time. He was pastor to presidents. And he followed, first of all, he lived a wild life. Then he came back to faith. And then he kind of followed in his grandfather's footsteps and built this big evangelical empire. Then everything came crashing down, and it wasn't pretty. So he was gracious enough to come on my podcast and tell me his story. And I know I tell you guys this all the time. Manlihood's not a Christian podcast, but I'm a Christian. And so it's one of those stories, though, because I wanted him to come on the show, one, because I'm not afraid to talk about Jesus. I'm not afraid to talk about God, whether or not you as a listener are a Christian, because I think that the stories of redemption is something that anybody can learn from and listen from. You can have everything, and you can fall down, and you can get back up again. And that's what we can learn from today. We can learn to have grace for people. And we can learn that you shouldn't be too big for your britches. And you shouldn't get arrogant. There's a lot that we can learn from Tullian today. So we're going to get into that story here in just a minute. Before we do, I just want to encourage you, make sure you check out Manlihood Plus. It's where you're going to get bonus content, where you're going to get extra content that you're not going to find anywhere else. You can subscribe on YouTube and Spotify, where you're already listening to the podcast. And if you sign up for it there, you're just going to pay a nominal fee, and then you're going to get all kinds of extra content on that channel. So if you're already subscribing to us for the free stuff, you just pay a little bit of money, and then you get a whole bunch more stuff. Seems like it's a no-brainer to me. It's a win-win. You give me a little bit of money, you support Manlihood, and you also help yourself as you're growing in your personal development. You're supporting yourself as you're growing and learning as a man. Seems pretty simple. So make sure you sign up for Manlihood Plus. Now, before we get any further, I just want to encourage you guys, don't tune this out. Don't just shrug it off. I want you to really pay attention to the stories that he tells in his interview today. As he talks about his book, Carnage and Grace, I want to encourage you, get the book, read the book, listen to the stories that he tells, because this is his true life. He's going to warn you of the mistakes he made and the cost that it cost him, because I think it's a story worth telling. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Tullian Tchividjian. Tullian, it's great to have you on the show today. Thank you for being with us, man. I appreciate you.
Thanks for the invite, Josh. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it if you could, I know that because of the circles that I run in, being in the church world and, kind of growing up, you are somebody and your family is a family that I have been familiar with my entire life. Not
Hmm.
all of our guests might know you or your story. Maybe you could just kind of introduce yourself and talk about who you are, if you could.
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. I'm 52 years old. I am married for the second time to my wife, Stacie. I was previously married for 21 years, got divorced back in 2015, remarried my wife, Stacie. I got remarried to my current wife, Stacie, almost 8 years ago now. We have a blended family of 5 kids. She has 2 boys, and I have 2 boys and a girl. They're all grown up and out of the house, except for my daughter, who is 22, the youngest of the 5. She lives with us here in South Florida. I have 3 grandsons. My oldest son has 3 boys. So I have 3 grandsons. I became a granddad at the ripe young age of 42 years old and love it. Absolutely love it. I'm a Florida native, was born in Jacksonville, raised in Fort Lauderdale. I come, as you mentioned, from a well known family. My mom's dad, so my paternal grandfather, was Billy Graham, who some people may know and others may not, but very famous preacher. In fact, in history, would probably go down as the most famous preacher of the 20th century, was personal confidant and counselor to every president since Harry Truman, both Republican and Democrat, a world leader under any definition of that word. Uh, Grew up as in South Florida, as I mentioned, middle of 7 kids. My mom and dad had 7 kids. I'm right in the middle. I'm number 4, so I've got 2 older brothers and an older sister, and 2 younger brothers and a younger sister. Um, I am a pastor in Jupiter, Florida, which is just north of West Palm Beach. I pastor a church called The Sanctuary, which, as I tell our people and anyone else, it's more of a recovery place masquerading as a church, which I'll get into later. We've been here for 5.5 years. Before that, I was a pastor of a large church in Fort Lauderdale prior to my divorce. And then in 2015, when the shit hit the fan and my entire life came crashing down, I got out of the public eye for a number of years, got out of ministry for a number of years, was trying to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And God really dragged me kicking and screaming back into ministry, which is not what I wanted to do. But here I am doing it, and I'm very grateful to be doing it. I've also written 8 books. My most recent book is entitled Carnage and Grace. The subtitle is Confessions of an Adulterous Heart. And it's really a very real, raw, real retelling of the last 10 years of my life. How I went from high to very low to sort of recovered on the other side. So that's that's the Cliff Notes version of who I am and my life. I mean, that describes more sort of my life externally, in terms of who I am. I am a dad, I am a grandfather, I'm a husband, a pastor, and hopefully a
Awesome, man. Yeah, those statements of identity right there. That's the kicker. I've been doing a lot of thinking about
Mhm.
that. How identity, man, we get so hung up on the labels on what we do.
Yep.
We're like, well,
Yep.
yeah, I'm Joe. I'm a plumber, and
Right.
yeah, what happens when you can't plumb anymore?
Yeah, I often say, and I have said for years, that when our roles become our identity, we experience an identity crisis every time our roles change. And so it's a super important conversation to have regarding who am I really? I mean, we tend to define ourselves and other people by what they do or the roles they play. But that's not descriptive of who we are at our core. And so, yeah, identity is a huge, huge issue.
So, so your book, Carnage and Grace, reading through that, you sent me a copy of it, and yeah, talking about that story, your story, really, first of all, growing up, in the shadow of, like you said, probably one of the most famous preachers of all time. There's a lot of almost a weight. I come from a ministry family, in a lot of ways. I mean, my parents weren't my dad wasn't a pastor, but he was a preacher, you know what I mean? And he did, my family was always at the church doing ministry, and there was a lot of responsibility there. My wife is a pastor now, and I've been a worship leader and served in ministry for a long time. Our household has always been that. And I know the kind of weight that bears, the kind of responsibility that bears. And when something goes wrong and your kids mess up or you mess up, like, that's a hard thing. And so, have you gone through that a few times in your life? That
Oh, man. The first thing I like to say about the family I grew up in is I never felt any pressure from inside my family to be a certain way or to do certain things. And that's huge credit to my grandparents, to my mom, to my dad. They really encouraged us to sort of be whoever God created us to be. And a proof of that is the fact that only two of us, there's 19 grandchildren, and only two of us are in any kind of pastoral ministry. There are some that lead nonprofits, and sort of associated with ministry in a variety of different ways, but only two of us went to seminary and became pastors. So that proves that there wasn't this overarching pressure from inside the family to sort of get into ministry, so to speak. My grandparents and my parents in particular really believe that you're supposed to do whatever God calls you to do. And being in ministry doesn't make you more special than not being in ministry. It's a vocation, it's a job, it's a responsibility that you carry out. But pastoral ministry is not a higher calling than being a plumber, an attorney, a doctor, a bridge builder, a leader of a nonprofit, or a corporate CEO. And so I never felt that. I never felt that pressure, which I'm very grateful for. I think as I got older, I was a wild man. Like, I dropped out of high school at 16 years old, got kicked out of my house at 16. I was the black sheep of my family, a complete wild man growing up in South Florida, where anything and everything is available to you that you want to indulge in. I took that hook, line, and sinker. And that lasted for probably, 6 years or so. And at 21 years old, there wasn't one particular crisis or one particular event. It was just this culminating sense of there's got to be more to life than what I'm experiencing. There's got to be more to who I am than what this world is telling me. And so, very much like the prodigal son parable in Luke 15, I kind of sheepishly made my way back into the fold and was welcomed warmly, hospitably. My parents, my family, my friends, the people who were connected to my family, who had been praying for years that, God would sort of rescue me from the far country, were thrilled that I was back. And I knew at that time that I didn't know what my life was going to look like. I didn't know what I was going to do professionally, but I knew that I wanted to spend the rest of my life telling people about this amazingly gracious God who pursues ragamuffins and rebels like me. I knew that because a lot of the people that I grew up around in terms of my friend group during those years, their rejection of God or their rejection of Christianity was really a rejection of a caricature of God or a caricature of Christianity. That for most people, Christianity is all about good people becoming better people. And as far as church goes, church was a gathering place for all the good people. The bad people didn't go to church. The bad people slept in on Sunday mornings or whatever because they were out too late on Saturday nights. And so that was the impression. That was the impression I got growing up from the churches and Christian schools that I was a part of, and that's the impression that a lot of people had. So I wanted to spend the rest of my life telling people that's not true. God loves and uses weak people who fail because there aren't any other kinds of people. And so as time went on, that was when I was 22, I knew I wanted to go to college. I didn't know how that was going to happen because all I had was a GED. Dropping out of high school, all I had was GED. Didn't have, SAT scores or anything like that. But found a college, a Christian college in South Carolina that accepted me on probation, which basically meant you can come, and if you can prove over the course of your first semester that you can handle it, then you can stay. And so I did, thrived in my college years, loved it. I was older when I went to college. I was 22 when I started, so I knew exactly why I was there and what I wanted to study and what I wanted to learn. So I took my collegiate career seriously, graduated with honors in 3.5 years. As my college career was coming to an end, it became pretty clear to me that I wanted to go on and get more schooling. And so moved from South Carolina to Orlando, Florida to attend a seminary that I had known for many years and had some pastor friends who had graduated from there. And was there for 3 years, and then got a call to serve a church in Knoxville, Tennessee as an associate pastor to everybody in their 20s and 30s, a large church, and loved it. And then 2 years into my time there, I got a call from a group of people back home in Fort Lauderdale asking if I would come home and start a church, which I did not want to do. I didn't know the first thing about starting a church, planting a church. I knew nothing about that stuff. But I ended up moving my family there at the time. I was married to my now ex-wife, Kim. We had 3 kids, small kids. We moved back home to Fort Lauderdale, planted a church. That church was doing remarkably well. And then that church merged with a much larger church that I then became the pastor of about 5 years after the church we started was in existence. And I think as sort of I got older, even though I didn't feel any pressure from people I didn't feel pressure from I didn't feel pressure from my family, didn't feel a lot of pressure from my professors in college or people that I knew, but I started imposing pressure on myself. And I think as I've done a lot of thinking about this over the years, what was it that contributed to my downfall in 2015? And I'll get into that in a minute, but some of it had to do with just radical discontentedness. I mean, I had risen, at least in, my industry, I had risen to the top. I was writing books every year. Some of them were bestsellers. My sermons were broadcast on the radio every day. They were broadcast around the world on TV every week. I mean, I had arrived professionally in that regard. I was pastoring this megachurch in my hometown of Fort Lauderdale, and none of it was enough. None of it. And I think when you grow up, and this is no fault of my family at all, but when you grow up on the front row of a worldwide impacting ministry and organization, and that's the air that you're breathing, you can get a real taste for that and want to be a part of something like that yourself, want to lead something like that yourself. And so it didn't matter how big I was or how influential I may have been at the time. It was so inferior to what I had grown up around, with my granddad being who he was. So I was always reaching for a higher rung on the ladder, always. I could have books that win awards, and if they sell 100,000 copies, I'm upset that they didn't sell 150,000 copies. I'm comparing myself with other people all the time during that season. And, I wanted every sermon to be better than the last sermon, every book to sell more than the last book. I was preaching against performancism while I myself was on a performance treadmill and didn't even realize it at the time. I had, if there are 10 boxes in life, I had 8 of them checked. And, 80% of my life in that regard was a dream come true. And yet the 20% that seemed elusive is what I went after. And in doing so, sacrificed the 80%. To try and secure the 20%. I think that's something that, whether you're in ministry or not, I think men face that kind of temptation across the board. I work a lot with men these days, and it doesn't go away as you get older. In fact, in some cases, it gets worse because you start looking back at your life as you get older and thinking, I haven't accomplished nearly what I set out to accomplish when I was an idealist 20-year-old or 25-year-old or 30-year-old. And so you're constantly reaching for that higher rung. You're constantly craving more than what you have. It's a discontentedness that can become very enslaving. I know that was the case for me. And in my case, pretty much everything was going well. My first marriage, I met my first wife when we were both 18 years old, and we were both wild. And then I became a Christian and she became a Christian. I grew up in a Christian home. She did not, but largely in part due to the influence of my family. She started going to church. She became a Christian. We got married at 21, had our first child at 22, our second child at 24, our third child at 28, I think. Yeah, 28. And so life started fast and furiously for us. I was in school the first 7 years we were married, and then just career-wise, my career just started to skyrocket. And I forgot about the most important things in pursuit of this, elusive satisfaction that I was looking for in something smaller than what God had already given me. And so that marriage ended in part because I was unfaithful to my first wife back in 2014, 2015. And when all that came out, because I was a very public person, when that came out, it was a very public fall. There was not a news source, Christian or not, that didn't report on it. I wanted to crawl into a hole and die. I didn't want anyone to see me again. I was embarrassed. I was filled with regret. My family was now broken. I ruined my life and the lives of those I love because I simply wanted more than what I had, trying to fill voids. Yeah, since that time, that was 10 years ago, there's been a lot of recovery that's happened, a lot of reconciliation that's happened, a lot of living amends that has taken place, a lot of hard work. A lot of the deep work that is always uncomfortable, but in the end, very freeing. And I'm in a completely different place. I look back at that guy now, who I was, and I think, dude, I would kick that guy's ass if he walked through my door. There are days that I feel like that. And then there are other days where I feel like I just want to give that guy a hug and say, dude, it's okay. You don't need more than what you have. Sort of love him in that regard. But yeah, I'm in a totally different place. Like I said, I'm remarried now to my wife, Stacie. We've been married for 8 years. Great relationship with my kids. In fact, that was never interrupted, thankfully. I always had a close relationship with my kids. My oldest son, Gabe, is 29. My son, Nate, is 27. And my daughter, Jen, is 22. And we're all still super close. Yeah, life looks very different now. It's a lot less impressive. I'm not as in demand. I have a lot less these days, and yet I could care less about that stuff now. I'm very, very grateful for what I have. I think someone asked me a few months ago, what is one word you would use to currently describe yourself? And I just said, grateful. Extremely grateful. I'm grateful that I have a roof over my head. I'm grateful for the friends that I have. I'm grateful for the job that I get to do. I'm grateful for the relationships that I have with my kids, with my wife, with my extended family. I'm just grateful for smaller things these days. And it took losing a lot of the big, sexy stuff for me to become very appreciative for the small, seemingly insignificant stuff. And yet now I see those seemingly insignificant things as the most significant things in my life, for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I know it may be painful. Obviously, I think you seem to be the kind of guy who understands the redemptive value of looking at the painful things and sharing it to help other people. That's kind of the nature of ministry work, obviously, but it may be painful to go back there. But let's go back and talk about the fall, the big fall. And the reason for that is because I know that the guys that are listening, whether they be Christian men or not Christian men, we've all been in those moments, where there's that Achilles heel that takes us down, whether it's, whatever it is. But I think that maybe walking through that process or talking about that story a little bit might be helpful to that guy who, if he hasn't taken the fall yet, or if he's, maybe your, let's talk about what led up to it and then how to avoid it, so
Yeah.
that we don't make
Yeah.
the same mistake if we could,
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, I've already alluded to sort of what led up to it in a sense. I mean, life was big, life was sexy. I was a rock star. People liked me. I was in demand. I mean, I was getting full of myself. I was becoming prideful. I mean, I was still a nice guy, and the people around me would have said he's a nice guy and he cares about me and all of that stuff. But underneath all of that, I was an ambitious guy, really, really wanted to keep rising higher than I was, felt in some ways entitled to it. Um, and and yet there was this void inside of me. I mentioned the fact that I had more than one affair. I talk about this stuff very openly in Carnage and Grace and walk through it meticulously, but had more than one affair. And a lot of times when people hear that a man has had an affair, they simplistically think, well, they're trying to fill some physical void, some sexual void. It's all about sex. And that may sort of grab headlines here and there, but that's not always the case. That was not the case for me. Some people assume that, well, when women have an affair, it's because they're trying to fill some emotional void. That's not always the case either. It's much more nuanced than that. It's much more diverse than that. For me, it really wasn't about sex. I think for me, it was much more about connection and wanting to feel a kind of newness and a kind of connection that had gone away in the course of a 21-year marriage. And I was getting a lot of attention back then. And so I could have that connection with someone else if I wanted it. And didn't start off with sort of devious intentions at all. But I got too close to a handful of different women over the years. And as those voids grew, I started looking to them to fill some of those voids and my connection with them to fill some of those voids. I grew up surfing, and I was telling my daughter the other day, I kind of likened this whole drift of mine back then to surfing. Growing up in South Florida, the waves that we get here are a result of wind. It's not like California where it's a result of a groundswell coming from under the water. It's a result from wind blowing the top of the water. And so there's always whenever there are waves down here, there's always a real drift. So you can paddle out to the lineup where the waves are breaking. And if you're not constantly paddling just to stay in the same spot and you sit on your board while you're waiting for a wave, you can look up in 5 minutes and be quarter mile down the beach without even realizing that you've drifted. You don't feel it when it's happening. And so for me, it really was like that. It happens so slowly and so subtly that you don't really feel yourself drifting as far as you're drifting. And then you wake up one morning and go, where in the hell am I? And more importantly, who in the hell am I? What have I done? Where have I gone? How did I get so lost? What happened to me? And so, rarely do these kinds of things come on like a sudden tidal wave. They're much more like the slow creeping of the tide that you can barely notice in real time. You only notice afterwards. And so I think, without trying to psychologize it too much, I really think that for me, it was the hunger for attention, the desire for connection, the sort of the daunting sense of discontentedness, and all of that stuff mixed in with where I was living, the kind of world that I was in. It was just a recipe for disaster. I think sometimes ambition can be incredibly toxic It can be very misleading, can be incredibly toxic. You start thinking very stupidly and naively that you're more important than you are. I mean, I may have been a big deal in the world that I was in, but that world, in the grand scheme of things, is a very, very tiny world. And so, the whole phrase Christian celebrity or celebrity pastor, I mean, that just makes me throw up in my mouth, that stuff, because, any celebrity pastor knows that they're not really a celebrity. I mean, if you've ever actually been around a celebrity, like I did growing up with my granddad, I mean, he was not just famous in religious circles, he was famous around the world for a whole host of things. I mean, you start believing that you're more important than you are. You start believing that you're bigger than you are. You start believing that you're entitled to more. So, yeah, I mean, there were just a lot of, I mean, I say this, and I don't mean to sound condemning across the board, but I mean, the Christian religious industry, books, magazines, music, churches, institutions, it is as corrupt when it comes to that stuff as any other industry in the world. I mean, I know that. I've lived behind the scenes. I've seen it. I mean, it is. And when I say corrupt, I mean, I'm not talking about, shadiness with money or those typical, which, I mean, in some cases it is. But, I mean, I'm talking about just the whole cultural milieu that exists, and people jockeying for position, and the politics that happen inside the religious community, and how the ambitious are rewarded, and how they're the ones that are standing up at all the big conferences in front of these pastors of smaller churches, and everyone sitting there is led to believe, like, man, this guy did it right, and if we do it the way this guy does it, we'll have a big church too, and that'll mean that we'll become more important just like this guy. Maybe 10 years from now, I'll be on stage. I mean, the entire industry encourages that kind of thing. So even though I pastor this church called The Sanctuary here, we are a modest place. We don't really market. We don't really advertise. And I'm really disconnected, to be honest with you, from sort of the religious industry, the Christian industry, the industry that I was in before. And because I'm so disconnected from it now, and I spend more time in recovery places and with my gym buddies who are not believers, I mean, I spend more time with people like that, real people like that, and so disconnected from the industry that I was in before, that I feel like I can see a little bit more clearly now what some of the industry hazards are, and what they can lead to. So I'm, in that sense, I'm much more free now, which is why I can talk about my own shit so much more openly than I could before. Not that I didn't before, but I'm much more specific these days. And I don't really fear rejection. I've already been canceled, so I can't really go anywhere. So I'm wide open about my story and the dark corners of my life, and how God's grace incessantly meets me in my darkest places time and time and time and time again. And I think for the most part, especially to my friends that aren't believers, that's refreshing to them. To the people in our church, that's refreshing to them. I said earlier that when we talk about the sanctuary around here, we talk about it being a recovery place masquerading as a church. And if you've ever spent any time with anybody in recovery, you'll know that they are some of the most honest people on planet Earth. They've hit rock bottom. They have nowhere to go. They recognize that they are their own worst enemy, that the problem is not out there, it's in here. That I am the primary problem of my life, not him, not her, not them. And those people are really refreshing to be around. And one of the things that I say all the time is that you don't have to be a recovering alcoholic or recovering drug addict or recovering sex addict or food addict to be a person in recovery. If you're a human being, you're in recovery. We're all recovering from rejection, loss, regret, all those things. And because we're all broken people living in a broken world with other broken people, we are all recovering. So there are really only two kinds of people in this world: people in recovery who know that they are, and people in recovery who think that they're not. But there's no one who's not in recovery. And when you understand that about yourself, when you understand that about other people, it's a much healthier place to be. It's a much healthier way to live. We don't have to pretend we're better than we are. We don't have to edit ourselves and Photoshop ourselves in order to feel like we're gaining the approval that we long for, all that kind of stuff. And so I'm in a very different place than I was. And there are things that I miss, I miss the opportunities that I had. I hate the fact that my children's family is now broken up, that their mom and dad are not married. I know that's hard for them. There are just a lot of shattered dreams in the wake of my failure, a lot, both my shattered dreams and other people's shattered dreams. And so, there's a part of me that wishes I could go back in time and, make a bunch of different decisions to avoid all that stuff. But as I look back now, I think to myself, this, in a sense, at least from God's perspective, kind of had to happen in order for me to get walloped across the face with a 2x4 enough to kind of wake up and see just how enslaved I was to things that I had no idea I was enslaved to. So it sounds crazy to say, because in the first 2 years after my crash and burn, I was bona fidely suicidal, man. I have never been a depressed person in my life. I was depressed. I couldn't get out of bed. I didn't want to leave the house. I didn't want to see people. I had zero hope. I was 43 years old at the time and had no clue. Money was running out, had no clue. Family was broken, had no clue what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Felt really abandoned by the sort of the Christian community. So I felt very much isolated and all alone, and I never want to experience that kind of despair again, ever. And yet now I can look back and go, okay, I hate that what happened hurt so many people, including me. But I'm now, in a sense, grateful, because I'm so much healthier and so much more free than I used to be. And I'm grateful to God and his amazing grace for that.
Yeah, man, I can relate. I haven't made the same mistakes or had the same issues, but I can relate to those moments where people turn their back on you because of something in your life or something that's happened. The people that are supposed to have your back, because they're Jesus people, and they're like,
they rarely do.
Yeah. And you're like, okay. But then you've got the ones that don't, the ones that prove what it's all about. And those are the ones, dude, I might get teary eyed. I'm sorry. Those are the ones that show you what it's all about. And you're like, that's the person I want to be.
Yeah.
That's the person I want to be. And so, like this past year, we've been through some stuff, dude. And, I can think of those guys that showed up, at 10 o'clock at night, like, hey man, we're going to pray for you right now. And, I'm like, okay, you're the guy I want to be like. So I've been trying to do that for people. And yeah, those recovery guys, we got a lot of those guys in our community, and they've taught me a lot. Dude, I was like, I just posted on my social media today. So this is actually going to air later, right, than when we're recording. But I hit a pretty big milestone in my weight loss journey, because I'm a recovering food addict, man. Like, so today, now by the time this airs, it's going to be even more. So it's going to be like old
Good
news.
For you, dude.
It's going to be even old news. But as today, I'm 74 pounds lighter than I was in May, several months ago. So like I've been like killing it. So I've lost 74 pounds right now, and and it was those guys in recovery who beat heroin and beat booze, telling me their stories about living under a bridge and stealing their grandmother's money, to get a fix. And I'm like, I know what it's like to hide, my receipts for pizza, and you know what I mean? So I don't get caught. I know I might not know what it's like to steal from my grandma, but I know what it's like to be sneaky to get my fix.
Absolutely. Dude, and that's what gives us so much connection with the rest of the human race. Like, I sit around with guys in recovery, and I'm like, guys, thankfully, I was never an alcoholic. I was never a drug addict, although I did smoke weed all day, every day for about 8 years back when I was from 16 to 22 or 14 for 14. But I mean, I've never really had a traditional addiction the way that we typically think of it. But dude, I know what it's like to lose. I know what it's like to live with haunting regrets. I know what it's like to live with the guilt and the shame of hurting people that you love, burning bridges, screwing things up. I know what that feels like. And that immediately connects me to everybody else that's in recovery, even if the circumstances are different. There's it's the gift of desperation. We know what it's like to be desperate, and people who know what it's like to be desperate because they themselves are desperate are able to connect with other people who feel the same way, regardless of what the circumstances are or what your particular struggle is. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, and you said this a minute ago, church is supposed to be the safest place for broken people to break things and fallen people to fall down. But unfortunately and sadly, it's too often the scariest place for broken people to break down and for, fallen people to fall down. It just is. I mean, there's this expectation, like I said earlier, that, church, the religious community, the Christian community is made up of good, strong people who are, morally righteous. And that makes people like me and probably people like you, and I'm sure a lot of other people that are listening to this feel like, well, if that's what church is for, if that's what Christianity's for, well, then it sure as hell isn't for me because I'm none of that stuff. And it's a massive deception. And I think the reason we call our church the sanctuary is because there was a time when the word sanctuary meant something. It wasn't a building where people gathered on Sunday mornings to worship God. It was a place where guilty people could flee and not be subject to the laws outside the building. I think of Les Mis in this regard, when Jean Valjean seeks sanctuary in the monastery. And as long as he's there, the long arm of the law can't touch him. And so sanctuaries are intended to be refuges, places where broken people can break down without judgment and hear everybody around them go, yeah, me too. And they're not that anymore, sadly. They're not. It makes me both sad and pissed that it's not like that, because I know so many people who have rejected God or rejected Christianity because the impression they were given was that God is for good, clean people. And if you're not good and clean, then you better get good and clean if you ever hope to get an audience with God. I hate that bullshit. I mean, I hate it with a passion. Churches should be the safest place, and they're typically the scariest place, especially when the shit hits the fan. But I also discovered when it comes to friendship, in and through all of this, that, when you're at the top, it's very difficult. When things are going well, you're at the top, it's very difficult to know who your friends are because you have so much to offer. But when you're at the bottom, and all you have to offer the people around you is leprosy and liability.
Right.
You discover very quickly you don't have nearly as many friends as you thought you had. And I realized, sadly, at the time that I had a lot of acquaintances, I had a lot of colleagues, I had a lot of people around me, I had an entourage, but I didn't have a whole lot of friends. And I think that was partially due to the fact that I probably wasn't a good friend myself. I've learned a lot over the years, the last 10 years, about what friendship really is, what it looks like to be a non-blinking friend, the kind of person. I posed this question a while back on my social media. I think it was something like this. What kind of person should you be to someone who has fallen? And the answer is the kind of person you will run to when you fall. That's it. We tend to look at people who fall down and break down, and we judge them and we condemn them and we look down on them. And in doing so, what we're essentially saying is we're better than they are. We would never make the same mistake that they have made. And the fact of the matter is that, You are, I am, we all are capable of failing and falling in a way that is unthinkable to us right now. And the good news of Christianity is that God's grace is big enough to cover the fact that our greatest failures may be in front of us. And so that's where I find my rest. It's His grace. It's the outrageous mercy of God, the amazing grace of God, the unconditional love of God that is my anchor in this life, in this topsy-turvy life, in my case, carnage-filled life. That is my hope. That is my anchor.
Yeah, for sure, man. Yeah, just kind of weighing a lot of that. I think what a lot of our churches and communities, right? So like even aside from the church communities and our friendships, I think what a lot of people might be waiting for, because I think all of us, even those who think that they're not, even the people that are pointing fingers, because they're really a lot of times just deflecting the fact that they're just like you, right? They're just like me.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe people are just waiting for somebody to go first. And there's always that risk that you're going to have somebody judge and you're going to have somebody pull away. And then down the road, they're going to, because I can't tell you how many times in my life I've been the one to go first. And at first they judged. And then it was their turn and they came back and they said, I'm sorry. I was in the same boat.
Me too, man. Me too.
So
I had a pastor call me, this is maybe, I don't know, 8 months ago. And he had wanted to get in touch with me because he was going through something similar to me. And I through a mutual friend, passed my number along to this guy. We ended up jumping on the phone, and he said, he's younger than me, and he said, before we start, I need to apologize. Now, I had never met this guy, didn't know who he was. He said, I need to apologize. And I said, for what? And he said, I need to apologize because when you were going through all of your shit in 2015, and it was all the headlines, I was in seminary, and me and all of my buddies, I mean, we just railed on you, man. I mean, we judged you, we railed on you. He said, and now 10 years later or so, at the time, I think 8 years or 9 years later, I'm going through something very similar, and I need to apologize. I'm sorry. So you're right. In fact, I talk about going first a lot in Carnage and Grace. It's scary. When I wrote the book, it took me 18 months to write that book, and I was hesitant to even write it. The other 7 books I've written usually took between 6 and 8 months. This one took me a year and a half, in part because I had to step away from it from time to time because it was so hard to write. I mean, I was revisiting some of the darkest moments of my life and having to revisit the hurts of people that I love. And so it was very painful and yet very healing at the same time. It took me 18 months, and I'm so grateful for the editor that I had for this book, a good friend of mine named John Blaze, who kept pushing me to go deeper. There were so many times I was like, I've said enough. I don't need to go into more detail. And he just kept pushing me and pushing me. And the reason he even had to push me is because I was scared shitless. I mean, I'm like, dude, people already think I'm a freaking loser. I'm an asshole for squandering so much that I was given. Now I'm going to go and tell them this story? I mean, literally, like, what am I? And yet he was very wise in continuing to press me and push me to go deeper, to tell more, to be even more honest, to be more open. And I was really scared to do it. But my mentality going into it was, screw it, I'll go first. Like, it's not fun putting all of your dirty laundry out in the public square for public consumption. I mean, it's not. And so I was initially very nervous, but the response that I've gotten from people I'll probably never meet has been so encouraging for the very reason you just said. These are people who finally feel like, okay, somebody understands me. Somebody understands. And it's not a book for pastors who have fallen. It's a book for people who have experienced loss. And I just happen to tell my story in the way that I lost, but it connects with anybody else that's felt lost or feels lost. And And it gives people hope. A lot of people, it gives people hope that, okay, so there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And I always caution people whenever they say, how did you get from where you were to where you are now? Like, you've arrived. And I'm like, are you shitting me? Arrived? I'm like, I'm just more self-aware these days to know that I haven't arrived, that every day is basically a grind, that I'm always, 3 bad decisions away from it being a tabloid headline, and I'm already on, decision 2. So, I mean, it's just, I recognize that if it's not God's grace that protects me, sustains me, keeps me, fuels me with hope, I'm screwed, dude. And I know that now in a way that I didn't before. And I've seen the ugly parts of me in a way that I would have never admitted, even to myself back in the day. And I've seen those parts. And because I've seen those ugly, dark parts of myself, it's also enabled me to see God's grace in a new light and appreciate it more than I ever did.
So if we can real quick ask a real quick question too, that I think just kind of popped out of this. If there's a guy out there who's saying, how can I avoid falling into the affair hole?
Mm-hmm.
What would you tell him?
I might want to rephrase that.
I didn't want to. I said it the way I did on purpose.
I'm just kidding. You got to laugh about this stuff.
I knew what I did there.
That's why we're friends. First of all, every guy's different and every marriage is different and the issues in every marriage is, and so it's hard for me to give sort of universal advice in that regard. What I can say is this: it promises what it cannot pay. I mean, Jesus said, what does it profit a man to gain a fortune and lose his soul? And, you can apply that or think about that metaphorically, even in the context of adultery or infidelity or having an affair. What you will sacrifice as a result of trying to fill some void that this relationship, I promise you, cannot fill, will leave your life marked with so many scars. It is so not worth it. I had a guy, I was doing a Q&A session at a church a few years ago. And after sharing my story and talking about the radicality of God's grace, like I always do wherever I go, this guy said, well, if what you just said about God's grace and forgiveness is true, then what's to prevent me from cheating on my wife? And I was like, dude, because it will fuck up your life. That's why. You want to hurt your kids? You want to ruin your marriage? You want to, my gosh, dude. Like, I had this dream from the time I was a little boy that I would be sitting on the beach when I'm 80 years old with the wife of my youth, her wrinkled hand in my wrinkled hand, and me looking at her and saying, I didn't think we would make it. And there were times when I thought we wouldn't, but here we are, and we're surrounded by our kids, and we're surrounded by our grandkids, and we're on family vacation. That will never happen now. Never. And that's just one small example of the kinds of things you're not thinking about when you're feeling the newness of something exciting and forbidden. It's so deceptive. I know for me, more than drugs, alcohol, anything like it, more than sex, even more than all of that stuff. It's just the feeling of aliveness, of feeling freshly discovered by somebody. That is so enticing. It's so intoxicating. And when you're in it or when you're on the verge of it, it's almost all you can see. You're not thinking about the sacrifices that you would be making if you went down this road. You're not thinking about the losses that you will endure if you go down this road. It's almost like you're operating with total blindness. And pursuing this thing because it's the thing you've been looking for. It's the thing you've been missing. It's the thing you've been longing for. And it's fool's gold. It really is fool's gold. And both men and women that I've talked to over the years who have fallen prey to the same temptation will all say the exact same thing. Whether they are a person of faith or not, they will all say the exact same thing. That infidelity, affairs, adultery, that kind of stuff, it absolutely unravels your life. I was under the mistaken notion, okay, this is just tell you how freaking screwed up I was. I loved my life, but I wasn't crazy about my marriage, which is a pathetic thing to say. I should have been, but I wasn't. That had sort of run its course, and I was getting all this attention from other people and feeling more like a superstar to these other people than I did to my wife of 2 decades, understandably so. And I just wanted to feel freshly discovered again, feel like a superstar again. And so as I was getting this attention, and I literally thought to myself, I want my life to stay exactly the way it is. I just want to trade out my wife for something or someone new. That's what I thought. As if that's even a possibility. I mean, when the institution of marriage, somebody's marriage, comes crashing down, and every person who's been divorced will tell you this, you don't just lose the marriage, you lose so much of your life that has been built around that marriage. Your kids are no longer, you're not all living under the same roof. You have to deal with blended family issues when 2 people get remarried. Financial issues, in some cases, job issues, just all sorts of stuff. Your life comes unraveled when you end up going through a divorce, especially as a result of infidelity, because a lot of feelings have been hurt when that happens, and a lot of trust has been lost when that happens. And it sucks, man. So the best thing I can say to somebody who's teetering is take it from a guy who went down that path. I mean, full steam. And there is not a day that goes by that I do not regret those decisions. Not one. I said a few minutes ago, I'm grateful for what God's done with the shitstorm of my life and making me a healthier and freer person. But my God, man, I mean, there is not a day that goes by that I do not regret that decision, those decisions, because it was more than one, those decisions. There's not a day that goes by. I live with that. I will live with that. I tell people all the time, and I've always been this boisterous, fun loving, excited about life kind of guy. And I now live with a low grade fever of sadness across the board because of those shattered dreams, because of the guilt and the hurt. I mean, I talk about all that stuff in the book very, very openly about sort of what life feels like internally these days in the aftermath of all that stuff. It's just not worth it. It's not worth it.
Well, sir, I like to ask all my guests a few questions, and I know that you've got another call to get on, so now's a good time to break in and ask those. The first question for you is, what does it take to be a man?
Self-awareness, I think. And by that, what I mean is the awareness that you are far weaker than you think you are, far more frail than you think you are, far more susceptible than you think you are to things that are destructive, far more insensitive than you think you are, far more selfish than you think you are. As Jack Miller, an old Presbyterian minister, used to say, cheer up, you're a lot worse than you think you are. And I think that level, it takes a lot of strength to admit that you're weak. It takes a lot of courage to admit that you're scared. And I think real men know how to do that. Real men, what it means to be a real man is not this sort of superficial bravado. It is a willingness to go first, like we talked about. It's a willingness to say you're sorry. It's a willingness to admit weakness. It's a willingness to confess your sins. It's a willingness to admit failure. It's a willingness. It's a self-awareness that I think, as a Christian, I think is you're unable to get to that without an understanding of the gospel. And what I mean by that is the gospel is the good news that God's love for us and his acceptance of us is not dependent on what we do or don't do. It's dependent entirely on what Jesus has done for us. And because of that, because I know that I am unconditionally loved by God, I don't then need everybody else to like me. And because I know that I am fully approved by God and nothing can interrupt that, I don't need everybody else to accept me. And when you don't need everybody else to like you, and when you don't need everybody else to accept you, you're much more willing to tell the truth about yourself. Because I can tell you the truth about myself. And if you walk away as a result, I might not like it, but I'll be fine because God will never walk away. God will never leave me. No matter who leaves me, God won't. And that enables me to be sturdy. It enables me to be bold. It enables me to be honest, to tell the truth about myself, to be real, to be raw. Like I said, not to portray some superficial sense of strength, but to admit weakness, to cry when it's necessary and when it's healthy, to say sorry, like I said a few minutes ago. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of damage has been done, culturally speaking, regarding what is a man and the kind of pressure that puts on men to be a certain way, rather than just understanding a deeper level of self-awareness and an understanding of the gospel really enables you to be a human being, man or not, man or woman. I mean, it enables you to be a human being that is able to admit weakness, confess sins, acknowledge failures, tell the truth about you.
It's a good answer, man. Good stuff.
Well, thank you.
All right, let's say you get your hands on a DeLorean with a flux capacitor and you can get it up to 88 miles an hour and travel back in time and talk to 10-year-old Tullian. What do you want to tell him?
Man, what I would say to 10-year-old Tullian is probably different than what I would say to, let's say, 25-year-old Tullian or 30-year-old Tullian. But if I was going back to 10-year-old Tullian, I'd be like, dude, just have fun. Enjoy the moment. Enjoy, when you're young, you're always looking. When you're 10, you want to be 11. And when you're 11, you want to be 12. When you're 12, you want to be 13. And you just, you're never truly content with where you are because you can't wait to get to the next stage, the next thing. And now that I'm 52, and life, I look back over the course of my life and I think, man, life flies by, man. I mean, it seems like just yesterday my kids were, 7, 5, and 1. And now they're old and having their own kids, or older and having their own kids. And man, I just want life to slow down. I can't make time stand still, and I want to. It seems like it's yesterday that my 9-year-old grandson was born. And no matter what I do, I can't slow time down. So if I were to go back to 10-year-old Tullian, I would just be like, dude, just enjoy the moment, life. And the problem with going back to 10-year-old Tullian is 10-year-old Tullian isn't going to listen to 52-year-old Tullian in the same way that 10-year-old Tullian wouldn't have listened to 52-year-old anybody else. But if I could go back, I think that's what I would say. I'll tell you, if I had access to that DeLorean and could go back in time, I would probably want to go back to like 43 years old, right in the aftermath of that crash and burn and public fallout, and just give that dude a hug. I know a lot of people wanted to give that guy a slap. I would just want to he was so hopeless and so scared and felt so alone, even though he was living in a mess of his own making. Still didn't mean he didn't feel alone and scared and hopeless. And I would just want to put my arm around him and be like, dude, it's going to be okay. Just one foot in front of the other. It's going to be okay. And if you need to fall down and take a rest, that's fine. God's got this. But yeah, I could probably go back to each stage of my life and say something different to that version of myself.
And then we also wonder about, then you mess up the time-space continuum. But, it's still a good thought exercise.
You do. Totally do. And then you got to go back to fix that. Right.
Right. I think they made a whole series of movies about what happened.
They did. I forget the title of the movies, but I vaguely remember them.
All right. Last question for you, man. What is your best advice for the men that are listening today?
Oh, man. The best advice I could give them, and I know this can only happen as a result of God's work, but I would simply say, trust God, man. He knows you better than you know yourself. He knows your life. He knows your struggles. He knows your fears. He knows your insecurities. He knows your sins. He knows your secrets. He knows you better than you know yourself. He's out for your good. He's out for your freedom. He's out. He's your friend. He's on your side. He's with you. trust him. Trust him. He's got you. He's powerful and gracious, and he's got you. That is a struggle that I face on a daily basis. I'm constantly wanting to put both of my hands on the wheel of my life and control outcomes and sort of manipulate circumstances and all of that stuff. And that just ends up becoming exhausting. And any guy listening who's honest will say, yeah, that is exhausting when we talk about gaining control of your own life and what that looks like and what that means. And that ends up feeling like a huge burden. Like, I got to get this right. This is all on me. I got to make things happen. I got to make it work. A lot of men feel like it's on them to make life go and to make the lives of those around them go. And that it's all riding on their shoulders. And that is an incredibly enslaving and burdensome way to live. And so I would simply say, just trust God. He's got it. Work hard. Do what you know, just on the horizontal plane of life. Love the people around you well. Be present to those primary people in those primary relationships, spouse, kids, family, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, trust God, because we have much less control over our lives than we think we do. We delude ourselves into thinking that we control the universe, that we're the masters of our own domain, and we're not. And when we start believing that, life becomes, we begin feeling the pressure cooker that life is. And it can be, like I said, exhausting and enslaving. So, relax. What I tell the people at our church all the time is, just enjoy the gift, man. Enjoy the gift. Relax. Enjoy the gift. The way I describe the Christian life sometimes is, the gospel, the work of God on our behalf is the breaking open of the piñata. And the Christian life is simply gathering the candy. That's it. Relax. Enjoy the gift. So if I were, depending on which guy I was talking to, I'd probably say something more specific. But yeah, in general, that's what I would say.
Awesome. Hey, so if our listeners want to connect with you, they want to get your book, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
They can find Carnage and Grace on Amazon. It's on there at Barnes & Noble. I'm pretty active on social media, more so on Instagram. I used to be much more active on Twitter back in the day, but much less active there. Much more active on Instagram. I think my Instagram handle is Tullian TCH, the first three letters of my last name. I'm pretty active on Facebook. I respond to messages very quickly. In fact, I respond to almost every message I get, which takes a significant amount of time. But I enjoy that. I enjoy connecting with people. I'm there for people. I mean, I get strangers reaching out every week, people who are in a jam, finding themselves in a jammed up for one reason or another. And I do my best to try to connect with them and sort of coach them through, counsel them through whatever it is they're going through. So if you're a ragamuffin and you're someone who has fallen and can't get up, call me. I'm your dude. I know what that feels like. So anyway, yeah, those would be the primary place. I think Facebook is Tullian T, maybe, is my Facebook handle. But if someone just Googles Tullian, they'll get all that stuff.
Awesome. I'll make sure to link to your profiles too here in the show notes so guys can click on it and connect with you. So
great, man. Great.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with our listeners today. I appreciate you being you, man. It's good stuff.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it. I can't wait to come back on sometime.
Yeah, dude. Hey, we'll have you on anytime. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great, man. Thanks, man.
Thank you. Tullian, thank you so much for the time that you spent with me in this interview. Thank you so much for honestly becoming friends. We've had some really great conversations since this. You're a great man. You're a good dude. And look forward to coming down to Florida at some point and connecting with you. If you ever find your way up here in the Great White North, I don't know why you would want to come up here to the Great White North, but if you ever want to, you've got a place to stay. So I think you'd enjoy it. So again, I appreciate you and thank you very much. Guys, thank you guys so much for listening and tuning into this episode. Make sure you share it with a friend. If you know somebody that would appreciate this story, please share it with them. I appreciate you guys so much. Thanks for tuning into Manlihood. Leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to. Make sure you subscribe. As always, I love you. I'm proud of you. And I'll see you next time.
Thanks for being part of Manlihood. Now it's time for you to rise up and take action. Join the Manlihood Man Cave, our free Facebook group, and connect with the other men on the same journey. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share that episode with a friend. For more, visit manlihood.com.